Hey guys, tonight we begin with the utterly reckless, occasionally poetic, and often puke-covered experience of getting wasted in medieval times. When alcohol wasn't just for fun, it was safer than the water, more reliable than a doctor, and significantly cheaper than a confession. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're a peasant in 13th century Europe. You've been working the fields since sunrise, you're caked in mud, your back hurts, and you're parched. But instead of reaching for a glass of water, you do something your modern descendants would find deeply alarming. You reach for a tankard of ale. And not because you're trying to get tipsy. No, it's because water could kill you. Medieval people had a healthy, well-earned paranoia of untreated water. Rivers and wells were convenient dumping grounds for sewage, dead animals, and the occasional unlucky traveller. Germ theory didn't exist yet, but people had figured out through trial and very unfortunate error that drinking straight from the stream was a shortcut to spending the night with your face in a ditch, or in a shallow grave. The solution? Small beer, a low alcohol, mildly fermented drink made from grains, barley, and whatever yeast happened to be floating around. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't strong, but it was safer than the plague-ridden puddle outside. Children drank it, nuns drank it, even monks drank it, though to be fair, they probably had better stuff. The average medieval person consumed about a gallon of ale per day. That's right, a gallon. Not because they were all raging alcoholics, though let's be honest, some were, but because they genuinely didn't trust water. It was also cheaper and easier to produce than wine, especially in Northern Europe. In many places, ale wasn't just a drink, it was a food group, a calorie delivery system in a cup. Liquid bread, if you will, and far less chewable than the mouldy stuff the local miller passed off as food. And no, people weren't staggering around drunk all day. The alcohol content in small beer was usually 1 to 2%, just enough to kill bacteria, not enough to start a tavern brawl before breakfast. But if you drank too much, especially on an empty stomach, things got wobbly. While peasants were chugging low-grade ale to avoid dying from swamp water, monks were doing something a little more refined, inventing medieval craft beer. Yes, in between chanting, copying manuscripts, and regretting their celibacy, monks were quietly becoming the OG brewmasters of Europe. Far from being casual drinkers, they ran full-on brewing operations in their monasteries, and they were good at it. Really good. Why monks? Well, monasteries were clean, relatively stable, and full of men with time, literacy, and access to big pots. Brewing became part of the monastic routine, just like praying, fasting, and passive-aggressively judging each other's handwriting. They brewed for guests, for pilgrims, for charity, and of course, for themselves. Let's not pretend Brother Pius wasn't sneaking a pint between Vespers and Matins. They also perfected recipes. Unlike peasants who just tossed grains in a pot and hoped for the best, monks documented everything. They measured ingredients. They timed fermentation. They even introduced hops to the process. Yes, hops, the plant that gives beer its bitterness and lets you pretend your IPA addiction is sophisticated. And while regular folks were drinking small beer, monks brewed stronger stuff. Why? Because they could. Also, because during fasting periods, solid food was banned, but beer wasn't. This brilliant theological loophole gave rise to what monks lovingly called liquid bread. It had calories, it had flavour, it had alcohol. What more does a cloistered man need? Some monasteries got so good at it that their beer became famous across regions. Townspeople would visit the abbey not for spiritual enlightenment, but for the booze. By the 14th century, many monasteries were running what we'd now call microbreweries, except instead of a guy named Chad in a flannel shirt, it was Brother Gregory with a tonsure and impeccable fermentation notes. Monastic beer became a brand. Even today, several beers still carry names tied to old monasteries, proving that holy men really understood the sacred relationship between man and mug. Before Instagram, before Facebook, and long before you could ruin your reputation with a tweet, there were taverns. And in medieval times, taverns were where everything happened. Weddings were planned there. Deals were made there. Fights broke out there. And yes, people got properly, gloriously, biblically drunk there. Taverns were the medieval answer to both the office and the town square. You went there to hear news, gossip about your neighbours, argue about taxes, and occasionally find out if someone had been secretly excommunicated. It was basically a medieval Reddit thread, except with more beer and slightly fewer trolls. Slightly. The interior was simple: a dirt or straw-covered floor, rough wooden benches, an open hearth, and a tavern keeper who may or may not have cleaned the mugs this week. The air was thick with smoke, garlic, and regret. And on busy nights, you might find travelling musicians, dice games, or an impromptu pig auction taking place between rounds. The drink menu? Modest. Usually ale, maybe cider, and if you were lucky or rich, a bit of wine. But no one came for the variety. They came for the chaos. And in a society where most people worked from dawn to dusk in back-breaking conditions, a tavern was more than a drinking hole. It was a pressure valve. It's also where social boundaries blurred, temporarily. In the tavern, peasants could bump shoulders with merchants, clergy might share a bench with the town blacksmith, and occasionally, someone might start speaking Latin after 2 cups, and no one would stop them. Everyone was equal under ale. Until someone knocked over a jug, then all hell broke loose. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Church leaders complained that taverns were dens of sin, and city councils tried regulating them with about as much success as regulating pigeons. But the truth was simple. Taverns were essential. They kept communities together, let steam blow off, and gave people a place to lose arguments, money, and memory, all in one night. In medieval Europe, how drunk you got, and how much dignity you lost in the process, often depended on your social class. Because getting wasted wasn't a one-size-fits-all experience. It came in tiers, like a really unstable wedding cake with a goat sleeping under it. Let's start at the bottom. The peasant. Your average village labourer drank small beer or weak cider throughout the day, not to party, but to stay alive. It was a calorie source, a water substitute, and frankly, one of the few affordable pleasures in a life full of blisters and taxes. Peasants drank from wooden cups, clay jugs, or, if things got really desperate, their hands. Getting wasted wasn't always the goal, but on feast days, you could count on someone waking up in a haystack with no memory and someone else's shoe. Now, slide up the muddy social ladder to the nobility. Here, alcohol was about status. Nobles drank wine, ideally imported, absurdly expensive, and served in a goblet that could double as a helmet. Wine was often sweetened, spiced or perfumed, because nothing says power like drinking something that smells like your grandmother's closet. Feasts in noble courts were liquid marathons, multiple courses, endless refills, and toasts that went on so long you could grow a beard mid-sentence. Getting drunk at court was common, even expected, but it had to be done gracefully. Slurred Latin and wine-stained robes? Forgivable. Throwing up on the bishop's lap? Slightly less so. Then there were the monks and clergy, floating in their own bubble. Technically celibate, occasionally sober. Monasteries brewed beer, but the priests drank wine. For sacramental purposes, of course, which is a polite way of saying they were usually tipsy by Vespers. But whether peasant or noble, the one universal rule was, don't waste it. Alcohol was valuable. Every drop came from labour, fermented, stored, and hauled by someone who'd rather be napping. You drank what you had, and you respected it. Or you got in a fight with the baker and ended up in the stocks. Drinking was the medieval equaliser. It dulled misery for the poor, and inflated egos for the rich. Everyone got something out of it. Some got hangovers, some got legends. So, you might be wondering, what exactly did medieval people drink when they wanted to unwind, or just survive another day of ploughing, plague, or papal taxes? Let's begin with ale, the true backbone of the medieval beverage lineup. It was unfiltered, uncarbonated, and often thick enough to chew. Brewed from barley, oats, or whatever grain hadn't been stolen by rats that week, ale came in multiple strengths: small beer, light, regular ale, buzzworthy, and the kind that made you see angels or start reciting poetry, sometimes both. Next was mead, the drink of choice for those who wanted to feel a bit mythological. Made from fermented honey and water, it was sweet, strong, and popular at feasts, or among people who thought regular beer just wasn't theatrical enough. If Ale was the village plumber, mead was the bard with the lute and questionable eye contact. Then came wine, mostly for the rich, the monks, and anyone living in southern Europe where grapes were more plentiful than morels. But medieval wine was a far cry from your modern Merlot. It was often sour, weak, and routinely mixed with herbs, spices, or even seawater. Yes, seawater. Nothing says "I'm classy" like sipping a Cabernet that tastes like brine and regret. You also had cider and perry, fermented apple or pear drinks popular in orchard regions. Sweet, fizzy-ish, and dangerously easy to overdrink, especially if you were already 2 tankards deep into your no-work-today plan. And then, things got weird. Some folks drank braggot, a medieval hybrid of beer and mead, usually strong enough to peel paint. Others enjoyed posset, a bizarre hot mixture of curdled milk and ale. Picture a foamy soup made by someone who's angry at cows. Occasionally, medicinal concoctions came into play, herb-infused wines that promised to cure everything from headaches to demons. Whether they actually cured anything is questionable, but after 3 cups, no one cared. And finally, there was ale mixed with raw egg, for the brave and the soon-to-be nauseous. Did it help with strength? Maybe. Did it smell like something you'd regret? Absolutely. If you think medieval people drank a lot during regular days, you should see them at a feast. These weren't your grandma's polite dinners. They were all-night carnivals of consumption, meat, music, merriment, and massive quantities of booze. And getting drunk wasn't just accepted. It was basically built into the seating arrangement. Feasts happened for any occasion: weddings, holidays, the birth of a royal heir, the return of someone who hadn't died from crusading, or just because the Lord was bored and wanted to show off his new goblet shaped like a falcon. The drinking began early. Wine or strong ale was poured by the gallon, and guests were expected to participate, enthusiastically. Refusing a toast could be seen as rude, suspicious, or even unpatriotic. In some courts, it was practically treason. Toasts weren't just cheers. They were elaborate rituals with speeches, blessings, and the occasional passive-aggressive poem. And every toast was followed by more food, more drink, and usually more bad decisions. Nobles drank from ornate cups, gold, silver, sometimes carved horn, because even intoxication had to be a performance. Meanwhile, servants scurried around refilling mugs, clearing trenches, aka edible plates made of stale bread, and quietly judging everyone. As the evening dragged on and inhibitions vanished, the party often devolved into a blur of singing, wrestling, and long-winded storytelling no one asked for. There are medieval records of people dueling mid-feast over who told a better joke or whose beard had more dignity. And then came the entertainers. Minstrels, dancers, jugglers, or that one guy who made inappropriate shadow puppets after too much mead. All fueled by the same overflowing pitchers. If things went well, you left wobbling, full of roast goose and good cheer. If they went poorly, you woke up under the table next to a jester and a broken lute, swearing you'd never drink again. Until next week. Feasts were structured chaos, and alcohol? It was the social glue and the accelerant. If you thought beer pong was the peak of human civilization, allow me to introduce you to the chaotic world of medieval drinking games, where the stakes were high, the rules were vague, and the chance of injury hovered somewhere around Absolutely. Getting wasted wasn't just a side effect of medieval socializing, it was the main event. And games helped move things along. These weren't structured contests with scorecards. No, these were activities that started with laughter and ended with someone passed out in the turnip bin. One of the most common pastimes? Toasting wars. 2 or more people would try to out-toast each other, not in clever words, but in sheer volume. It was less about poetry and more about surviving round after round without slurring through the words, "to the king's goat." Another classic was casting the dice, often played for drinks, coins, or questionable favours. The dice were crude, often carved from bone, and the rules changed depending on who was sober enough to explain them. And if the game ended in an accusation of cheating? Well, congratulations. You just invented medieval bar fighting, which we'll cover later. There was also, who can drink the most the fastest? Not a creative name, but extremely popular. This was less about winning and more about achieving bragging rights and possibly liver failure. Medieval men prided themselves on how many tankards they could down before falling into a hedge. In noble circles, drinking games were wrapped in rituals and manners, like courtly pledges. A lady might challenge a knight to drink a full goblet in her honour, a task he'd accept dramatically, possibly while composing a short, epic poem and trying not to belch through the rhyming couplets. And of course, there were games with physical consequences, balance contests, spinning challenges, and impromptu wrestling once someone mistook the minstrel for an ogre. The point was never really to win. The point was to drink more, laugh harder, and test the durability of the local furniture. In medieval Europe, drinking wasn't just socially acceptable, it was theologically endorsed. The church may have wagged its finger at taverns and bar fights, but when it came to wine, that was holy business. Let's start with the basics. Communion wine. At every Mass, the priest would lift the chalice, say a few sacred words, and boom! It was now the literal blood of Christ. And then he drank it, often several times a week, sometimes daily. Now, it's not like priests were doing keg stands in the cathedral, but the ritual meant a steady, respectable intake of wine, all in the name of salvation. And wine wasn't reserved just for communion. Monasteries produced barrels of the stuff, technically for religious use, but somehow always with enough left over for, let's say, personal reflection. Monks documented their vintages, praised the divine quality of fermentation, and occasionally ended sermons a bit slurred. Then you had saints who were practically the patron protectors of partying. St. Bridget of Ireland once prayed for a lake of beer for the heavenly host. And yes, that's a real quote. St. Arnold of Soissons is said to have saved thousands by urging people to drink beer instead of water during a plague. Science? No. Accidentally correct. Absolutely. Even religious festivals doubled as excuses to drink. Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days, they weren't just for praying. They were for feasting, singing, and warming your soul and bloodstream with ale or mead. Pilgrims often stopped at monasteries where monks offered hospitality in the form of bread, shelter, and just enough wine to make the next leg of the journey spiritually questionable. And if you passed out under the altar table, well, you were just resting in the presence of the Lord. Of course, the Church condemned excessive drinking, but like most medieval rules, enforcement was wildly inconsistent. A noble might get a stern sermon, a peasant might get tossed in the stocks. A monk, he'd just get reassigned to less liquid duties. Let's be honest, in a world where beer was safer than water, someone was always bound to overdo it. And while medieval society loved a good feast and a bit of booze-fueled cheer, there was a limit. Once you crossed the line from merrily tipsy to shouting at goats and trying to joust a fence, that's when the town stocks came into play. Yes, the dreaded stocks, medieval society's favourite blend of punishment and public entertainment. These wooden contraptions clamped your ankles, wrists, or neck and left you stuck in the village square, exposed to the elements, hecklers, and occasionally a very disappointed sheep. Getting put in the stocks for public drunkenness wasn't rare. If you were loud, rude, vomited somewhere sacred or strategic, or decided to moon a local bishop, you might find yourself clamped into public humiliation by dawn. The punishment wasn't just physical, it was deeply social. Your friends, neighbours, and that one nosy blacksmith's wife all got to watch you squirm, stew, and sober up slowly in full daylight. Children might throw old vegetables. Monks might mutter scripture at you. Someone would definitely say, "Seen that one before." Ironically, you weren't always punished for drinking, only for being bad at it. Nobles could drink themselves into a coma at feasts with no consequences. But if a cobbler tripped into a pig trough after 3 ales? Suddenly, it was a moral crisis. Authorities saw public drunkenness as dangerous, not because of the alcohol itself, but because it made people unpredictable. Slurred speech and stumbling were fine behind closed doors, but out in the streets, that's how revolts start. Or worse, folk songs. Some towns even had ale tasters, whose job was to make sure tavern beer wasn't too strong, or at least not stronger than the mayor's tolerance. Still, being drunk in public was rarely treated as a crime. It was a mild disgrace, a social slap on the wrist. You weren't a criminal, just someone who got a little too medieval on a Wednesday night. And after a few hours in the stocks, you walked away stiff, shamed, and probably planning your next visit to the tavern. Just quieter this time. Hangovers in the Middle Ages were exactly as awful as you'd expect, minus the ibuprofen and minus any sympathy from your neighbours. You wake up on a pile of straw, the church bells are going off like Judgment Day, and there's a goat staring at you because apparently you passed out in its stall. Again. So what did medieval people do for hangovers? Well, for starters, they powered through it. You had chores. You had obligations. You didn't have time to complain about your head splitting open like a rotting melon. You just muttered something about sin and staggered back into the daylight. But some people, bless them, did try actual cures. One popular one? Raw eggs in ale, because nothing says recovery like mixing what wrecked you with what might give you salmonella. Others swore by vinegar, or fennel tea, or infused herbs, which usually tasted like grass and sadness. If you were lucky enough to have access to a doctor, and I use that term loosely, they'd talk about imbalanced humours, and probably bleed you a little. Nothing helps a hangover like blood loss, right? Some just kept drinking. That's not a joke. Hair of the dog wasn't invented yesterday. Medieval folks figured, well, I already feel like death, might as well top it off with a warm mug of redemption. The church, predictably, had a different take. Hangovers weren't just your body punishing you, they were God punishing you. The prescription was repentance, and maybe fasting. Nothing cures a headache like guilt and a dry crust of bread. Honestly, most people probably didn't call it a hangover. They just called it Thursday. But make no mistake, getting wasted in medieval times had consequences. The difference is, you couldn't tweet about it. You just got up, wiped the ale crust off your face, and hoped nobody remembered what you did with that loot. At some point in history, someone invented alcohol, and about 5 minutes later, someone else got punched in the face with a mug. Welcome to the chaotic world of medieval bar fights, where your honour, your drink, and your questionable singing voice could all get you into trouble. Taverns were not quiet places. They were loud, smoky, smelly, and usually packed to the rafters with people who'd spent all day digging trenches, shoeing horses, or arguing with their landlord, and were now 3 ales deep and feeling bold. Arguments started over just about anything: spilled drinks, unpaid debts, dice games gone wrong, who had the better beard, who insulted whose ox, and occasionally, because someone thought the other guy looked too French. That was an actual insult in certain towns. Weapons weren't supposed to be brought into taverns, but let's be honest, this rule was as effective as modern no-smoking signs in 1990s bars. Daggers, clubs, even walking sticks could turn into weapons if the argument got heated enough. And if you didn't have a weapon? No problem. Tankards were heavy, and so were wooden stools. Tavern brawls ranged from quick shoving matches to full-blown furniture-destroying chaos. Sometimes the tavern keeper stepped in. Sometimes they just watched from a distance, arms crossed, calculating how many tables they'd need to fix in the morning. Local authorities usually didn't care unless someone died, or unless someone important got bruised. If it was just two peasants swinging wildly in the corner, while a lute player kept strumming in denial, it was basically a Friday night. But if a noble or a visiting merchant got involved, suddenly the law showed up and stocks were prepared. Or worse, you were fined a month's wages and banned from the tavern, which was basically medieval exile. Despite the risks, fighting was part of tavern culture. You went in for a drink and a laugh. Sometimes you got both. Sometimes you got a black eye and a story you weren't allowed to tell around your grandmother. Medieval drinking wasn't just a man's game. In fact, if you walked into a tavern or bought ale from the corner stall, there was a good chance a woman had brewed it, sold it, and maybe poured it on your head if you got mouthy. Enter the alewife, one of the most common and underappreciated figures in medieval booze culture. Alewives weren't just women who brewed beer. They were the primary brewers for centuries. Brewing was considered domestic work, like baking or churning butter, except it could get you tipsy and occasionally cursed out by hungover blacksmiths. These women brewed small batches of ale at home, then sold it out of jugs, windows, or tiny stalls called tippling houses. Some operated out of their kitchens, others ran full-on public alehouses. And yes, they could get in trouble, especially if their ale was too strong, too weak, or mysteriously made people hallucinate and fight chickens. Alewives were expected to follow local brewing laws, which changed depending on the town, the year, or the mood of the inspector. Prices were fixed by law, which meant if an alewife overcharged or watered down her product, she could be fined, publicly shamed, or forced to wear a paper hat declaring "bad brewer." Yes, really. Then there were tavern maids who worked inside the alehouses, pouring drinks, scrubbing tables, and trying not to get groped by guys named Oswald with 3 teeth and too much mead in his system. These women had to be tough, fast, and fluent in insults. Some were just trying to earn a wage. Others flirted their way to better tips. A few married rich drunks and retired early. The medieval dream. But women weren't just behind the bar. They drank too, especially at festivals, weddings, or after dealing with 8 children and a cow that refused to cooperate. Drunkenness wasn't praised in women, but it wasn't unheard of either. And if the ale was good and the night was long, a few verses of bawdy song were absolutely fair game. In the Middle Ages, if you were sick, injured, or just looked mildly uncomfortable, someone was going to hand you alcohol. Maybe it was a priest. Maybe it was your barber surgeon. Maybe it was your grandmother. But rest assured, the medieval solution to almost anything was, have a drink. And to be fair, it sometimes helped. Not because alcohol cured anything, but because when you're dizzy, feverish, or bleeding from a jousting mishap, a few cups of wine can take the edge off. Welcome to medieval medicine, where alcohol was painkiller, antiseptic, sedative, and occasionally breakfast. Doctors, and again that term's doing a lot of heavy lifting, routinely prescribed wine and ale. If you had a cold, warm wine, a headache, wine with mint, digestive issues, mead mixed with herbs, served in what was essentially a hollowed-out medieval mug and a prayer. Even monks brewed herbal liqueurs for healing purposes. These were strong, sweet, syrupy concoctions flavoured with wormwood, sage, or whatever looked vaguely medicinal in the garden. Today we'd call that digestive. Back then they called it medicine, and just hoped you didn't die. One particularly bold remedy involved soaking herbs in brandy, then drinking it to cleanse the humours. Whether it cleansed anything other than your self-respect is debatable, but you did stop complaining, either from numbness or unconsciousness. In battlefield medicine, alcohol had a real purpose. It cleaned wounds. Or more accurately, it stung like hell and distracted you from the guy sawing off your leg with something that used to be a farming tool. Sometimes they gave the patient a strong drink before the amputation. Sometimes they were the patient and just passed around the bottle. But medieval people didn't just use alcohol for injuries. It was prescribed for melancholy, plague symptoms, childbirth recovery, and spiritual despair. If you were breathing, there was probably a bottle involved. Did it work? Occasionally. Did it make things worse? Also occasionally. But hey, in an age where bloodletting was considered science and leeches were practically co-workers, alcohol was at least pleasantly wrong. If there's one thing governments have always been good at, it's noticing when people are having fun and figuring out how to tax it. And in medieval Europe, alcohol was no exception. Drinking wasn't just a pastime, it was an economic engine. Brewing, selling, and serving alcohol created jobs, generated revenue, and gave local authorities yet another excuse to write unnecessarily dramatic laws. Some towns even had ale conners, official taste testers who checked whether the beer was good, legal, and appropriately frothy. Not a bad gig, assuming you didn't mind gout. Taverns needed licenses to operate, though what counted as a license varied wildly. In some places, it was a stamped document. In others, it was just a verbal agreement with the local bailiff and a sack of onions as collateral. But if you served ale without permission, you could be fined, shamed, or shut down faster than a poorly played lute solo. Prices were also regulated. That's right, price caps on beer. Authorities posted ale prices on wooden boards, and alewives or tavern keepers who charged too much were punished. In theory. In practice, if your ale was strong and your cousin worked at the mayor's office, things got flexible. And then came the taxes. Ale taxes, wine taxes, malt taxes. In some places, there were even drinking vessel taxes. Imagine getting fined for using a cup that was too fancy. Welcome to medieval capitalism. Monasteries and nobles often had tax exemptions, of course, because nothing says divinely inspired like not paying duties on your barrels of mead. Meanwhile, peasants were stuck paying levies on every batch they brewed for family gatherings, even if it tasted like watery sadness. But these regulations didn't stop people from drinking. They just made them more creative. Some taverns operated unofficially, some brewers sold off the record, and others simply bribed the right people and hoped no one checked the ledgers too closely. The result? A booming, slightly illegal, ale-soaked economy, built on loopholes, gossip, and the unshakable human desire to have a pint at the end of a long day. In short, medieval booze wasn't just social, it was business, and business was booming. By the end of the medieval period, the way people drank, and what they drank, started to shift. Slowly, subtly, and with far fewer pigs in taverns. One major change came with the rise of stronger alcohol. Distillation, that magical process that turns wine into something that could clean wounds and erase memories, became more refined in the late Middle Ages. This gave birth to early versions of brandy, aquavitae, water of life, and other dangerously potent drinks that made beer look like toddler juice. At the same time, international trade expanded. Exotic spices, new brewing techniques, and, eventually, sugar and rum made their way into Europe. With every shipload of imported goods, drinking culture evolved. Mead and ale began to lose ground to wine and spirits, especially among the wealthy, who now wanted to sip imported claret and pretend they were part of the Renaissance. Taverns also got an upgrade. By the 16th century, some evolved into inns and public houses, early versions of the pub. Drinking was no longer just something you did after work. It became a structured part of travel, politics, and even postal delivery. Yes, medieval mailmen drank. Frequently. And then came the Reformation, which poured cold water and guilt on a lot of the party. Reformers like Calvin and Knox were not big fans of public drunkenness. Suddenly drinking became a moral battleground, and taverns were accused of being dens of sin, sloth, and questionable fiddle-playing. Governments got stricter, licensing laws multiplied, taxes increased. Public drunkenness was increasingly criminalized. But the desire for a good drink? That never went away. It just adapted. Alewives were pushed out by guilds and male-run breweries. Wine was regulated by state-appointed officials. Spirits became fashionable in court. And slowly but surely, drinking moved from an everyday necessity to more of a social choice. The Middle Ages gave way to modernity, and while we gained better sanitation, cleaner water, and slightly less mead, we also started to forget how deeply entwined alcohol had been with survival, celebration, and social life for centuries. In ancient Babylon, love was not a spontaneous, rosy-cheeked affair. It was war. And like any good war, it required strategy, incantations, and sometimes the assistance of a very grumpy demon. Babylonian love magic didn't shy away from meddling with the supernatural. If you couldn't win someone's affection through charm, you'd write their name on a cursed clay figurine and bury it near their door. Just like that, you had leverage. Who needs roses when you've got necromancy? The Babylonians believed love could be summoned, or subdued, through ritual and invocation. Tablets from Mesopotamian archives describe enchantments where a priest or sorceress would call upon Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, to bend the will of a target. And Ishtar was not the gentle, harp-playing type. She once destroyed an entire mountain range because someone dumped her. So, yes, she knew a thing or two about vengeance and passion. Some spells included hair, nail clippings, or drops of blood, organic tokens to tether the lover's soul to the spellcaster. These were either burned in small fires, dissolved into oils, or wrapped inside fabric pouches. These pouches would be buried beneath thresholds or hidden in beds to heat the heart of the desired person. That heating could sometimes cause obsession or madness. But hey, what's love without a little side effect? And it wasn't all about attraction. Babylonian texts also mention apotropaic spells, designed to drive away unwanted suitors or remove a rival's erotic pull. In one particularly nasty charm, a woman asked the gods to make her rival's breath smell like a corpse, subtle, effective, and guaranteed to ruin any moonlit moment. This mix of erotic desire and divine manipulation created a culture where love was a battlefield layered in ash, honey, blood, and whispers. You didn't just hope someone loved you, you dragged them into a cosmic tug-of-war, using scrolls, dolls, and invisible spirits to tip the scale. Love, in Babylon, was rarely mutual. It was an act of will, and when words failed, spells stepped in, etched in cuneiform, whispered to the stars, and sealed with sacred smoke. Babylonian love wasn't pure, but it was potent. In ancient Greece, love spells were less about hearts and flowers, and more about domination and desperation. The Greeks had a specific name for this magical obsession, eros. But it wasn't the gentle affection you'd write poetry about. It was a frenzied, all-consuming madness, more likely to land someone in a temple begging for mercy than walking hand in hand through olive groves. Greek love magic was split into two powerful branches, agoge spells and philia spells. Agoge spells were meant to drag someone, sometimes literally, to the practitioner. Usually used by men, these spells aimed to inflame lust, cause sleeplessness, and even make the victim hallucinate until they surrendered to desire. A typical agoge spell might say something like, "Burn her heart until she comes to me crawling." Yes, crawling. Greeks were not subtle about their intentions. The spells were often written on lead tablets, cheap, durable, and heavy with symbolism, and buried in graveyards or wells, places considered gateways to the underworld. Why? Because these spells often invoked underworld spirits or restless ghosts to do the dirty work. You wanted someone to fall in love? You'd call on a dead guy who had nothing better to do? On the other hand, philia spells were more affection management. These were often used by women trying to maintain peace in marriages or control their husband's wandering eyes. Rather than summon burning passion, philia spells focused on harmony and loyalty. They were sometimes infused into wine or oil, acting like magical tranquilizers hidden in daily rituals. Of course, herbs and potions played their part. Greeks used aphrodisiacs like mandrake root, which looked vaguely human and was believed to scream when uprooted, probably not ideal first-date material. Love potions also included honey, myrrh, and even crushed bones, mixed into drinks or rubbed onto clothes. A particularly strong recipe involved menstrual blood, an intimate and powerful ingredient believed to tie a man's soul to his lover's forever. Greek erotic magic wasn't romantic in the modern sense. It was strategic, visceral, and usually aimed at control rather than consent. Eros, the god of love, was often depicted blindfolded and armed with arrows for a reason. Love wasn't just blind, it was dangerous, and the Greeks knew exactly how to weaponize it. When it came to love, the ancient Romans took what the Greeks started and added more wine, more drama, and far more legal loopholes. Roman love spells weren't merely folk traditions whispered by lonely hearts. They were considered tools of influence, status preservation, and, occasionally, straight-up revenge. In a society obsessed with order and honor, controlling another person's desires became a stealthy way of rewriting fate itself. Roman love magic came in many forms, but deficciones, binding spells, were among the most popular. These were usually etched into thin sheets of lead and folded like cursed love letters before being buried in tombs or tossed into rivers. The idea? Entrap the target's mind, body, and spirit by invoking chthonic deities like Pluto or Hecate. The writing was often sharp, commanding, and full of desperate pleas. Some read like court summons, others resembled melodramatic fan fiction. A particularly eerie example from Rome asks that a woman named Victrix burn with love for me, Marcus, like a torch, day and night, until she can no longer bear to be without me. Sounds romantic. Until you realize Marcus buried that spell next to a child's grave to add extra power. Roman ethics. Optional. Perfumes and oils were another avenue for magical manipulation. Women would anoint themselves, or their intended lovers, with concoctions laced with herbs like vervain, mint, or even belladonna, which could sedate or stimulate depending on the dosage. A sweet-smelling woman might not just be trying to impress, she could have been dosing her toga-wearing crush with a micro-love spell in liquid form. One particularly scandalous Roman tactic was the so-called Venus wine, a potent love potion allegedly containing animal parts, exotic herbs, and bodily fluids. Slaves and courtesans were rumoured to slip it into their masters' goblets to tilt the power balance. If the potion didn't work, at least the hangover might spark some vulnerability. Roman law, interestingly, did acknowledge love magic, but not as a crime of passion. Instead, it was lumped into sorcery and considered a public threat if it disrupted property rights or inheritance. Love was all fun and games until someone cursed a senator into celibacy. For the Romans, love was political, magical, and occasionally toxic, just the way they liked it. In ancient Egypt, love was sacred, mystical, and dangerous in the hands of the wrong priest. Egyptian love spells combined religious devotion, poetic metaphor, and, when needed, ruthless manipulation. These weren't the ramblings of a heartbroken teen. They were carefully composed rites, often recorded on papyrus and backed by the authority of deities like Hathor, Isis, and Bez. If your heart was broken in Egypt, you didn't cry, you conjured. Egyptians believed love could be stirred like a potion or unlocked like a tomb, and their magic reflected this. A common technique was the dream spell, in which the spellcaster summoned a god or demon to appear in the dream of the desired person. The spell would whisper, "You long for her, like the desert longs for rain." Elegant? Yes. Manipulative? Absolutely. One recovered papyrus from the Ptolemaic period describes a spell where the target's heart is likened to a captive bird, fluttering endlessly unless reunited with the one who cast the charm. These texts were often written in red ink, considered magically potent, and sometimes included miniature drawings of bound figures or symbolic birds with clipped wings, a visual cue just in case the gods needed reminding. But it wasn't all about metaphor. Physical objects had power too. Wax figurines were used to represent both the spellcaster and the target. These dolls were anointed with perfumes, pierced with needles, or placed in jars with inscribed love formulas. And depending on the goal, passion or punishment, the results varied wildly. Want affection. Rub the doll with lotus oil. Want revenge for rejection. Add scorpion venom. Potions were popular, often involving ingredients like honey, wine, mandrake root, and, unsurprisingly, blood. Some spells even required menstrual blood mixed with beer, which was believed to bind the man's soul to the woman through shared essence. Offer that at a modern cocktail bar and see how it goes. What truly set Egyptian love magic apart was its divine undertone. These weren't mere tricks, they were invocations. Love and lust were seen as natural extensions of divine will. But divine will could be influenced with the right hymn, the right words, and a properly charged amulet. Ingredients that walked the line between medicine, magic, and outright poison. You weren't just wooing someone with roses. You were slipping them a cocktail of hallucinogens, animal parts, and sometimes your own bodily fluids. If modern dating is complicated, at least it doesn't usually involve powdered mummy. In ancient love magic, ingredients weren't chosen for their smell or taste. They were selected for symbolic and spiritual force. The more potent or taboo the object, the more power it was believed to have. Hair, fingernails, spit, and menstrual blood were commonly used because they contained personal essence. To bind someone, you needed part of them, or part of yourself. But some recipes went well beyond the personal. In Babylon, spells sometimes called for scraps of lion skin, crocodile fat, or the feathers of nocturnal birds, creatures thought to live between worlds. In Egypt, scorpion venom might be smeared onto amulets or mixed with myrrh to stir both desire and dread. In Rome, spells occasionally included the ashes of burned bones, or, disturbingly, the remains of condemned criminals. If love couldn't be earned, it would be stolen from the world of the dead. One particularly twisted Greek recipe instructed the user to obtain the bones of a bat, grind them with honey and wine, and leave the mixture beneath a moonlit statue of Aphrodite. Drink it, and your target would become mad with desire. Of course, they might also become mad, full stop. Many potions blurred the line between aphrodisiac and poison. Belladonna, mandrake, and henbane were all popular ingredients. Taken in the right amount, they induced lightheadedness and emotional openness. Taken in the wrong amount, well, let's just say love became eternal, in a tombstone kind of way. And while men often wielded love spells to incite lust, women frequently used more subtle means: clothing enchantments, food magic, or charm bags sewn with silken herbs. These might be hidden in pillows or hung beneath beds. One Babylonian spell even instructs a woman to anoint her breasts with a sacred oil before embracing her lover, making the moment both erotic and enchanted. Not all ancient love spells were meant to ignite passion. Some were curses in disguise, wrapped in seductive words but loaded with venom. These weren't about mutual desire. They were about domination, humiliation, or vengeance. And their true goal wasn't love, it was control. In ancient Greece and Rome, many so-called love spells were actually defictiones, binding curses meant to overwhelm the will of the victim. They might be phrased sweetly. May she think of no other man but me? But their methods were sinister. The idea was to shatter a person's emotional independence, rendering them sleepless, obsessed, and emotionally enslaved. If that sounds like psychological warfare, it was. These spells often targeted the mind and body. A popular Greek curse would ask deities of the underworld to bind the target's arms, legs, tongue, and even genitals, rendering them helpless unless they came crawling back to the spellcaster. Lead tablets inscribed with these curses were folded tightly, symbolizing the sealed fate of the victim, and deposited in graves, wells, or crossroads, all liminal places where divine and human realms met. One infamous Roman example begged Pluto to turn her thoughts into madness until she seeks me out in the streets. It included specific bodily instructions. Bind her knees so she cannot dance with another. Bind her lips so she cannot kiss another. It wasn't romance. It was emotional kidnapping, complete with ghostly accomplices. Sometimes these love curses included a second victim, a rival. In that case, the spell would redirect all of the target's passion to the caster, while simultaneously ruining the rival's chances. One spell from Carthage curses a woman's competitor with hair loss, a rotting voice, and womb sickness, a terrifying way to ensure she wouldn't be anyone's object of affection. Even in Egypt, where love magic often took poetic forms, curses seeped in. Some spells invoked lion-headed deities to tear apart a target's peace of mind until they submitted. Others used figurines of the victim, stabbed, burned, or broken, while reciting verses to bind their heart to the practitioner. Despite the elaborate rituals and eerie curses, ancient love magic wasn't always hidden in temples or carved into cryptic tablets. Much of it lived in the ordinary, woven into the routines of daily life. For many, casting a love spell was as natural as brushing one's hair or pouring wine. Magic wasn't separate from reality. It was embedded in it. In bustling markets from Babylon to Athens, vendors didn't just sell figs and perfumes. They also sold magical charms. Small amulets made from carnelian, hematite, or bronze were carried in tunics or sewn into garments to attract affection or shield against unwanted advances. Some were shaped like phalluses, others like tiny hands or eyes, symbols believed to either charm or ward off lust. A girl might wear one when hoping to catch the attention of a suitor. A wife might tuck one under her mattress to keep her husband loyal. Love magic also slipped into food. Meals were prepared with more than just spice. There was intent. In Rome, women were known to stir aphrodisiacs into sauces, pour honeyed wine laced with herbs, or serve bread kneaded with whispered spells. One Egyptian charm directed the user to breathe into the cooking pot and speak the beloved's name 3 times. Dinner became a slow seduction, each bite a step closer to enchantment. Even cosmetics weren't immune. Ancient Greek women ground special herbs into their eye kohl or lip pigments, believing it would make their gaze irresistible. A spell from the Hellenistic period instructed a woman to recite lines from a hymn to Aphrodite while applying rouge, transforming her daily beautifying routine into a sacred act of attraction. Clothing, too, carried magic. A Babylonian text recommends washing a garment in enchanted water before offering it to a potential lover. In doing so, the shirt itself became a charm, and if that lover wore it? The spell was said to tighten like a net. These everyday spells weren't always grand or theatrical. They were subtle, intimate, performed in kitchens, bedrooms, and bathhouses. To the ancients, love magic wasn't reserved for desperate sorcerers or vengeful aristocrats. It was for everyone. For all their seductive promises, ancient love spells were never guaranteed to work, and when they did, the consequences could be disturbing, even tragic. While many spellcasters imagined a blissful union as the result of their magical efforts, ancient texts and warnings suggest that love magic often unraveled in unexpected and terrifying ways. The same spell meant to bind a lover could just as easily summon illness, madness, or divine punishment. In Greece and Rome, philosophers and priests alike cautioned against meddling with the will of others. Theophrastus mocked those who relied on love potions, portraying them as foolish and desperate. Pliny the Elder flat-out labelled love magic as dangerous superstition, warning that its practitioners were either deluded or criminal. Even in magical papyri, cautionary lines were often included. Do not call upon this spirit unless you are ready to accept what follows. And what followed could be grotesque. One Roman legend tells of a man driven mad by a failed spell. He wandered the streets at night, calling out the name of a woman he no longer recognized. In another tale, a woman who used a potion to secure her husband's fidelity found herself the target of his obsession, as he became violent and paranoid, convinced she was unfaithful despite her original intentions. Some spells even warned that the gods might turn on the user. In Egypt, invoking Hathor or Isis without proper offerings could anger the deity, bringing misfortune instead of romance. One recovered scroll states, "If she is not meant to love you, your heart shall know sorrow tenfold." That's ancient for, don't try to force it. Rivals could also fight back. A targeted woman might hire a counter-magician to unbind her from the original spell or to curse the practitioner in return. These magical feuds could escalate into full-blown hex wars, with spells flying in both directions, sometimes over years. Protective charms, salt circles, and sacred words were all part of the defense. Perhaps most chillingly, love spells often succeeded in creating obsession rather than affection. The victim might feel compelled but confused, physically drawn but emotionally vacant. Love turned into compulsion, a haunting echo of true connection. Though the gods of Babylon have long fallen silent, and Roman grave tablets have crumbled, the heartbeat of ancient love magic never truly stopped. It simply adapted. The spells, potions, and rituals of the ancient world evolved, repackaged into folk traditions, whispered superstitions, and even self-help rituals we still see today. Take the concept of the love potion. While modern science scoffs at the idea of aphrodisiac elixirs, the shelves of health stores still overflow with tonics promising enhanced attraction, deeper intimacy, or natural magnetism. Ancient herbs like mandrake, damiana, and ginseng still find their way into teas and oils meant to rekindle passion. We may not invoke Venus or Ishtar anymore, but the desire to bottle love remains strong. In parts of southern Italy, folk traditions continue to echo Roman and Greek magical beliefs. Red ribbons tied under mattresses, herbal sachets hidden in clothing, and whispered charms passed down through grandmothers mirror the rituals once practiced in classical temples and street corners alike. In parts of the Middle East and North Africa, fragments of Egyptian and Mesopotamian love magic survive in talismans worn discreetly or spells spoken during cooking. Even in pop culture, ancient love magic lives on. Films, books, and songs often portray the enchanted lover, whether it's a vampire compelled by a blood bond or a potion slipping into a wine glass at just the right moment. The trope of the love spell gone wrong remains a favourite storyline, reflecting ancient warnings that passion conjured by force may unravel into chaos. More curiously, modern psychology has uncovered parallels between old spells and techniques used to increase attraction. Mirroring body language, using scent to trigger emotional memory, or timing confessions to maximize emotional impact. Were those ancient spellcasters simply using proto-psychological hacks, cloaked in divine language and ritual drama? Today, love spells are still sold online, though now dressed in pastel branding and witchy aesthetics. Etsy shops offer customized candle spells, while TikTok hosts manifestation tutorials that wouldn't seem out of place on a Greek papyrus scroll. In the end, ancient love magic wasn't just about getting someone to love you. It was about regaining control in the face of longing. That impulse, timeless, desperate, beautifully human, remains with us. We still chase that same alchemy, to be seen, desired, chosen. And if a little magic helps along the way, so be it. In ancient Greece, sport was not a pastime, it was a sacred duty, a divine performance of flesh and will before the gods. Nowhere was this more evident than at the Olympic Games, first held in 776 BCE in Olympia, a sanctuary site dedicated to Zeus. For over 1,000 years, Greeks from city-states across the Hellenic world gathered every 4 years, not for politics or war, but to chase immortality through muscle and grit. The games weren't casual contests. Athletes trained for months, sometimes years, under the watchful eyes of coaches, priests, and even philosophers. Before competing, they swore an oath to Zeus, promising they had prepared honestly and would not cheat. This wasn't just formality. Breaking the oath could result in public flogging or disgraceful disqualification. Honor was everything. And if you're imagining chariot races and discus throws with dignified robes flapping in the wind, stop. Greek athletes competed completely nude. It was a celebration of the male form, yes, but also a sign of transparency. Nothing hidden, no armor, no trickery. Just raw athleticism and the judgment of the gods above. The original events were simple. Foot races, long jump, discus, javelin, wrestling and boxing. Then came the pancration, a brutal combination of wrestling and boxing with barely any rules. Fingers were broken, eyes were gouged. The crowd cheered. Death wasn't common, but it wasn't forbidden either. Winning brought more than bragging rights. Victors were crowned with a simple olive wreath, but they returned home as heroes. Some cities awarded winners with free meals for life, prime seats at the theatre, or even exemption from taxes. Poets would immortalize their names. Sculptors might carve their likeness into marble. For a fleeting moment, they were godlike. But there was no room for women, not in the audience, and certainly not as competitors. The Olympic Games were for men only, though women did have their own separate festival, the Heraia, also held at Olympia, featuring foot races for unmarried girls. Still, it paled in comparison to the testosterone-fueled spectacle that defined the male arena. The Greek Olympics were more than games. They were a sacred fire, burning with ambition, discipline, and divine expectation. To run, to wrestle, to win. It wasn't just athleticism. It was ritual. It was legacy. It was war without weapons. If the Greeks turned sports into sacred ritual, the Romans turned them into a blood-soaked spectacle. In the Roman Empire, athletics meant violence, and no event embodied this more than the gladiatorial games. These weren't polite matches in tunics. They were brutal performances of life and death, designed to thrill the masses, honor the dead, and remind everyone who held the power. Gladiators were typically slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. But despite their low status, they became household names. Some, like Spartacus, rose to legendary fame, admired even as they were paraded into combat for the crowd's delight. Trained in special schools called ludi, these men, and occasionally women, were taught to fight with discipline, precision, and flair. The more theatrical, the better. Bleeding was part of the entertainment. The most famous arena was, of course, the Colosseum in Rome, an engineering marvel that could hold up to 50,000 spectators. Events were free, paid for by emperors and politicians eager to win public favour. Bread and circuses, they called it. Keep the people fed and entertained, and they won't ask too many questions about corruption or conquest. Combat styles varied. Some gladiators fought with swords and shields, secutores, others with nets and tridents, retiarii. Each type had its own strengths, weaknesses, and costume, carefully curated to keep matchups unpredictable and exciting. The games also included mock sea battles, wild animal hunts, and public executions. It was athleticism meets theatre meets horror. But not every fight ended in death. Contrary to popular belief, most matches ended when one fighter conceded. Killing a well-trained gladiator was bad for business. These fighters were investments. Only the editor, the person sponsoring the games, could decide if a loser lived or died. And yes, the infamous thumbs up or down gesture. Probably a myth. Ancient sources are ambiguous, so let's chalk that up to Hollywood flair. Despite their blood-stained purpose, some gladiators achieved celebrity status. They received gifts, fan letters. Yes, ancient graffiti has been found praising their beautiful thighs, and sometimes even freedom. Retired gladiators could become trainers, bodyguards, or minor celebrities. Long before football, baseball, or basketball, the peoples of Mesoamerica played a game that was part sport, part religious drama, and part cosmic allegory. Known today as the Mesoamerican ball game, or by its Nahuatl name, Olamalistli, this was no weekend leisure activity. It was a sacred rite, a political tool, and occasionally a death sentence. Played by the Olmecs, Maya, and Aztecs, The game involved a heavy rubber ball, sometimes weighing as much as 4 kilograms, that players had to keep in motion using only their hips, elbows, knees, or thighs. No hands allowed. The goal varied by region and era, but in many cases it involved hitting the ball through a vertical stone ring mounted high on the court wall. Considering the size of the ball and the limited body parts allowed, scoring a point was nothing short of miraculous. The courts, known as tlachtli or pok-to-pok arenas, were shaped like a capital I, with sloping sides and often surrounded by carvings depicting gods, warriors, and scenes of sacrifice. These weren't your average playgrounds. They were stages where the divine and human collided. And it wasn't just about winning or losing. The ball game was deeply symbolic. It represented the eternal battle between life and death, day and night, the gods and the underworld. In some versions of the myth, the game was reenacting the journey of the hero twins from the Maya Popol Vuh, who descended into the underworld and played against death itself. The most controversial element: ritual sacrifice. Contrary to popular myth, not all games ended in death, but many important matches, especially those tied to religious festivals, did. The sacrificed weren't always the losers either. In some elite contexts, the captain of the winning team was offered as a noble tribute to the gods, ascending, in theory, to divine favour through death. Others argue it was the losers who paid the price, a public display of cosmic justice. What's undeniable is the cultural weight of the game. It wasn't mere entertainment. It was theology in motion. The thud of the rubber ball echoed through temple plazas, a heartbeat of belief, identity, and power. When it came to physical activity, the ancient Egyptians blended leisure, ritual, and preparation for the afterlife. Sports weren't simply a diversion. They were reflections of cosmic balance, royal power, and divine order. While they lacked massive public arenas like the Greeks or Romans, Egyptian society still nurtured athleticism with a spiritual undercurrent that made every movement meaningful. Wrestling was perhaps the most visually documented of all ancient Egyptian sports. Tomb paintings dating back over 4,000 years show pairs of young men locked in grapples, executing complex throws and holds that wouldn't look out of place in modern judo. These weren't staged performances. They were serious training exercises that emphasized discipline, coordination, and balance. Wrestling was often used to train soldiers and elite guards, but it also had ritual significance, symbolizing the eternal struggle between order, Mahat, and chaos. Archery was another vital sport, especially for the pharaohs. Depictions of rulers firing arrows from chariots, sometimes while the vehicle was in motion, were not just records of skill, but political propaganda. A strong pharaoh was a divinely approved one, and mastery of the bow was proof of divine favor and martial readiness. During festivals, kings would sometimes demonstrate their prowess by shooting arrows through copper rings, surrounded by cheering priests and nobles. Rowing competitions also held a place in ancient Egyptian life, especially along the Nile. Crews of young men competed in ceremonial regattas, their synchronized strokes reflecting discipline and unity. These weren't just for sport. They honored the gods and recreated mythical journeys, like the solar bark of Ra crossing the heavens. For the everyday Egyptian, sports included tug-of-war, leapfrog-like jumping games, and rhythmic dancing, activities both joyful and communal. Children practiced balancing and acrobatics, while laborers stayed physically fit through their daily work. Athletic games during festivals often served as community bonding and religious observance, blending sweat with spirituality. Interestingly, Egyptian women participated more than in many ancient cultures. Wall paintings show female dancers and gymnasts performing at banquets and ceremonies, often in celebration of fertility and divine femininity. While not competitive in the modern sense, these performances were athletic, graceful, and held symbolic weight. In ancient China, sports weren't just about physical prowess. They were tightly woven into the fabric of Confucian values, military training, imperial politics, and the pursuit of harmony between mind and body. From battlefield simulations to courtly pastimes, Athletic activities served both the elite and commoners, often reflecting deeper philosophical ideals. Archery held a particularly exalted place. In Confucian tradition, the nobleman was expected to master the bow, not only as a warrior, but as a gentleman. Competitions were formalized and deeply ritualistic. During the Zhou dynasty, archery contests were held in ceremonial halls, where etiquette mattered as much as accuracy. Participants bowed, recited prescribed phrases, and shot not to kill, but to demonstrate inner virtue and discipline. Hitting the target was seen as a metaphor for hitting moral perfection. But not all sports in ancient China were so serene. Enter Jiju, Chinese polo. Introduced during the Han Dynasty and reaching peak popularity under the Tang, polo became the sport of emperors, generals, and aristocrats. Played on horseback with long mallets, it was thrilling, fast-paced, and surprisingly dangerous. Emperor Shizong of Tang even died in a polo accident. Still, the sport was embraced by both men and women of the court. Noble women in silk robes could be seen galloping alongside their male counterparts, striking balls with astonishing agility. In an age of rigid gender roles, polo briefly leveled the playing field. Military sports also flourished. Kuju, an early form of soccer, was originally developed to keep soldiers agile and coordinated. Players kicked a leather ball through a net or hole in a wall using precise footwork. Over time, Kuju became a popular civilian game as well, eventually gaining recognition as the earliest documented form of football. Martial arts, too, found expression through sport. Wushu and early forms of kung fu weren't just combat techniques, they were disciplines that cultivated the spirit as much as the body. Sparring matches and strength tests were common in military academies and public demonstrations, often staged during festivals. Even games like chess and go, Weiqi, were viewed as mental sports, testing strategy, foresight, and emotional control. The ideal sportsman wasn't merely strong, he was balanced, restrained, and morally upright. In the ancient Near East, spanning Mesopotamia, Assyria, Persia, and beyond, sports were rarely just games. Athleticism was often a reflection of power, divine favor, and military preparedness. Physical feats weren't celebrated in isolation. They were part of public ritual, royal image building, and the cultural machinery of empire. In Mesopotamia, the earliest known urban civilizations developed a range of physical activities, though they didn't formalize sport quite like the Greeks. Wrestling, for example, features prominently in Sumerian art and literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the hero wrestling the wild man Enkidu in a contest so fierce that it shakes the very foundations of the city, only for the two to end up as lifelong companions. Wrestling wasn't just for sport, it symbolized raw strength, dominance, and respect among equals. Kings were expected to be physically formidable. Assyrian and Babylonian rulers often commissioned reliefs showing themselves hunting lions or engaging in military drills. These weren't staged for mere vanity. They were political statements. Killing a lion by hand wasn't just a show of courage. It declared that the king could tame chaos and uphold order. That lion hunt? It was state-sponsored propaganda in muscular form. The Persians under the Achaemenid Empire developed one of the earliest formalized military training programs that blended athletics with ethics. Young boys were taught to ride a horse, draw a bow, and speak the truth, a triad that fused sport, warfare, and moral education. Archery and horse riding were both vital, not just for battle readiness, but as symbols of elite status. Public displays of strength also played a role in temple rituals. Festivals often included competitions like foot races, stone lifting, or even ceremonial fights, depending on the region and deity being honored. These events were watched by priests, officials, and sometimes even kings, reinforcing the idea that the body, like the city or the cosmos, needed to be strong and disciplined. One unique contribution from the Near East was the use of board games like the royal game of which, while not physically demanding, were seen as mental duels, sometimes even tools for divination. Just like with archery or wrestling, success reflected divine favor. In the ancient civilizations of South Asia, particularly the Indus Valley and early Vedic societies, physical culture was deeply interwoven with social hierarchy, spiritual training, and the pursuit of balance between body and mind. Though archaeological evidence from the Indus Valley is sparse in terms of organized sport, clues from urban planning, figurines, and later Vedic texts reveal a society that valued physical agility, strength, and discipline. The cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro featured large public baths and open courtyards that may have been used for communal gatherings, water rituals, or athletic exercises. Terracotta figurines show people in dynamic poses, wrestlers, dancers, and acrobats, suggesting that movement and performance were essential parts of daily life. Though no Olympic-style events are documented, the environment hints at a culture where the body was trained not just for survival, but for aesthetic and ritual purposes. As society transitioned into the Vedic period, the emphasis on physical prowess became more codified, particularly through Dhanurveda, the ancient science of warfare. Young warriors were trained in archery, swordsmanship, chariot driving, and hand-to-hand combat. Competitions often accompanied royal festivals, where princes showcased their martial skill to assert dominance and attract political alliances. Wrestling, Malayuddha, emerged as one of the most revered sports in ancient India. More than just brute force, it was a spiritual practice. Wrestlers followed strict dietary and moral codes, lived disciplined lives, and often trained in temples. The Akhara, a traditional wrestling school, functioned like a monastery, emphasizing mental purity as much as physical strength. The practice survives today in modified forms, still deeply respected. Ball games and dice games also appear in Sanskrit texts. Krida, the Sanskrit word for sport, encompassed everything from racing animals to playing strategy games. In the Mahabharata, even divine heroes like Krishna and Arjuna are shown participating in sports, often using their skills as metaphors for cosmic struggle. Yoga, too, originated during this period, not as a gentle stretching routine, but as a rigorous system of physical and mental discipline aimed at achieving spiritual liberation. Athleticism here was not for glory, but transcendence. Though often overlooked in historical accounts, women in the ancient world did participate in sports, though usually under strict limitations and in gender-specific arenas. When women trained, competed, or performed physical feats, it was often tied to fertility, grace, or ritual purity, rather than public spectacle or competition. Yet across cultures, we find surprising evidence of female athleticism, sometimes celebrated, sometimes suppressed, but never absent. In ancient Greece, women were banned from the Olympic Games, not just from competing, but even from watching. However, they had their own festival, the Heraia, held in Olympia in honor of the goddess Hera. Young, unmarried girls raced barefoot in tunics shorter than the norm, their hair loose in contrast to married women's veils. Though there was no javelin or pancration, victory was still rewarded with olive crowns and commemorated with statues. In Sparta, women enjoyed far more athletic freedom. Spartan girls trained publicly in running, wrestling, and throwing, often competing in front of male audiences. Their athleticism was seen as a civic virtue. Strong mothers produced strong warriors. While the rest of Greece found this shocking, Sparta viewed female strength as foundational to their militarized society. In Egypt, tomb paintings and reliefs show women dancing, leaping, and performing gymnastic feats, particularly in festivals and religious ceremonies. These performances, though not competitive, were demanding and athletic. Some scenes even show paired female acrobats in mid-air poses, suggesting a long tradition of trained movement and physical artistry. Ancient Rome offers more complex examples. While elite Roman women rarely engaged in public sport, lower-class women and slaves occasionally performed in arenas as gladiatrices, female gladiators. Though rare, inscriptions confirm their existence. More commonly, women participated in ball games, swimming, and equestrian training within private villas. In China, Tang Dynasty records show noblewomen playing polo, one of the only major sports that allowed women and men to compete side by side. Dressed in flowing robes, they galloped through imperial courts, striking balls with precision. These scenes shocked later Confucian historians, but they demonstrate a brief window where elite women wielded athletic agency. Though the crowds have vanished and the dust of ancient stadiums has long settled, the spirit of ancient sports still pulses through the modern world. From Olympic gold medals to football stadium chants, today's athletic culture owes more than just inspiration to the ancient world. It inherits its structure, its spectacle, and even its soul. The Olympic Games themselves are a direct resurrection. Revived in 1896, the modern Olympics were consciously modelled on their Greek ancestors, complete with ceremonial oaths, laurel motifs, and even the flame, a symbol once sacred to Hestia. The values may have shifted from divine favour to international cooperation, but the essential goal remains: to celebrate the physical limits of the human body. Roman influence echoes in our love for stadium sports. Massive arenas, structured leagues, and the theatricality of modern games, from entrance music to over-the-top commentary, mirror the gladiatorial shows of the Colosseum. Even the idea of cheering sections, uniforms and sports as national identity can be traced back to the imperial pageantry of Rome. Mesoamerican traditions resonate in the ways we tie sports to ritual and symbolism. Though no modern game ends in human sacrifice, thankfully, we still speak of athletes as warriors, matches as battles, and trophies as sacred objects. Victory remains mythologized. From China's elegant archery contests to the militaristic discipline of Persian training, the idea of sport as moral education has endured. Modern martial arts continue to teach not just movement, but respect, restraint, and self-mastery, values rooted in ancient codes. Even forgotten games like Cuju and Krida have seen renewed interest as historians and enthusiasts seek to rediscover the diverse origins of modern athletics. Ancient board games, too, are reappearing in popular culture, not as dusty relics, but as reminders that competition isn't always physical. Perhaps most striking is how the ancient world framed sports as more than recreation. They were political tools, religious expressions, and acts of identity. Today, when athletes kneel, speak out, or represent entire nations, we're seeing the same tradition unfold: sport as narrative, as power, as legacy. In short, the ancient world didn't just invent games, it invented the idea that through sport, humanity could aspire to greatness. Not just strength or speed, but honor, meaning, and the eternal pursuit of something just beyond our reach. Paris, the city of light, romance, revolution, and art. But few tourists realize that beneath the elegant boulevards and iconic monuments lies another city, far darker and infinitely more silent. A shadow Paris, stitched together by tunnels, carved into limestone and lined wall to wall with bones. This is the Catacombs, a 200-mile underworld filled with the remains of over 6 million people. The descent into the catacombs begins innocently enough. A spiral staircase leads you down, away from the noise of the living world. The air grows colder, the light dims, and then you're there, in the ossuary, a space where walls are literally made of human bones, stacked with disturbing precision. Skulls are arranged in rows like trophies, femurs cross-hatched in decorative patterns. Some tunnels even form shapes: hearts, crosses, columns. It's morbidly artistic and disturbingly calm. This macabre labyrinth was never built with tourists in mind. In fact, the catacombs began as limestone quarries, dug as early as the Roman era. Paris grew by using the very bones of its earth. Limestone for buildings, cathedrals, bridges. But by the 1700s, those empty quarry tunnels would take on a new role, because the living were running out of room for the dead. By the mid-18th century, Paris faced a dire crisis. Its cemeteries, particularly the infamous Saints' Innocents, were so overcrowded that corpses were literally spilling into nearby buildings. The stench, overpowering, disease, inevitable. Something had to be done. In 1786, officials began exhuming millions of corpses from overflowing graveyards and relocating them into the abandoned quarries. Workers moved cartloads of bones under cover of night, a grim procession lit by torchlight. The bones were dumped at first, then rearranged later into the haunting formations we see today. It wasn't just sanitation, it was spectacle. The result is a vast necropolis beneath a modern metropolis, a place where time stands still, where bones of plague victims, revolutionaries, and medieval monks rest side by side. The catacombs don't just preserve the dead, they hold the memory of a city that has always teetered between beauty and decay. So while Paris above sparkles with elegance, below it sleeps, silent, dark, and watching. By the mid-1700s, Paris was running out of space, not for the living, but for the dead. Cemeteries had become overburdened to the point of collapse, quite literally. The most infamous offender, the Cimetière des Innocents, located in the centre of the city. It had been in use for nearly 1,000 years and had accumulated centuries of corpses, layer upon layer, in shared graves, often stacked 6 or 7 deep. As the population grew, so did the problem. By the 18th century, the Innocents and other cemeteries had become bubbling pits of decay. The smell was inescapable, seeping into homes, churches, and markets. Residents near Saints Innocents complained of unbearable stench and frequent sickness. Meat spoiled faster. Water tasted strange. In some accounts, walls of nearby basements began to crack and leak human remains. It wasn't just grotesque, it was dangerous. In 1763, King Louis XV issued a royal decree banning burials within the city, but the church resisted. Cemeteries were sacred ground. Bodies were to rest in consecrated soil. But by the 1780s, the situation had reached a tipping point. After a cellar wall collapsed due to the weight of decomposing bodies on the other side, public health officials demanded a solution. The dead could no longer stay above ground. Enter the abandoned limestone quarries. These underground chambers, remnants of Paris's building boom, were mostly unused, dark, cold, and far from the eyes of the city. Perfect for a mass relocation of human remains. In 1786, authorities began transferring bones from Saints Innocents to the subterranean network. The work was conducted at night, out of public view. Workers wore long robes, and the carts of bones were draped in black cloth. Priests accompanied the processions, chanting the rites of the dead. It was equal parts grim and reverent. The transfer of bodies continued for decades. Other cemeteries were emptied too, Saint-Étienne-de-Grès, Madeleine, and Montmartre among them. As more bones filled the tunnels, officials began arranging them into patterns, both to save space and to provide a sombre sense of order. This crisis, born of too many dead and too little land, created one of the world's most chilling monuments. The catacombs weren't just a solution, they were a reminder that even in death, the city must be managed. Step into the ossuary section of the catacombs of Paris, and it becomes instantly clear. This is no random bone dump. This is architecture. A cold, meticulous symmetry crafted not from stone or brick, but from human remains. Skulls line the walls in neat rows, framed by femurs and tibias. Some sections form patterns, hearts, crosses, arches. Every structure is built not just to store bones, but to transform them into a kind of subterranean art. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It was the work of Louis-Étienne Héricard de Thury, the inspector of quarries during the early 19th century. While earlier transfers had simply involved piling bones in heaps, Héricard had a different vision. He believed the catacombs could serve as a moral and aesthetic monument, both a solution to overcrowded cemeteries and a reflection on the transience of life. Under his direction, the ossuary was cleaned, organized, and arranged into the haunting gallery we see today. The bones themselves, taken from millions of bodies, were anonymous. There are no names, no tombstones, just bone upon bone, arranged like library shelves of the dead. The only identifiers are plaques, small stone markers denoting which cemetery the remains came from, and the year they were transferred. In some sections, poetic inscriptions appear. One reads, "Stop. This is the Empire of Death." Structural stability was a concern too. The bones weren't just decoration. They were used to reinforce the existing tunnels. In some places, bones are packed behind retaining walls, hidden from view but essential for holding up the narrow corridors. Engineers had to be careful. They were working beneath the very city of Paris, and a collapse would mean more than just ruined tunnels. It could take whole neighborhoods with it. Lighting was sparse in the early days, just flickering oil lamps or torches that made the shadows dance across eye sockets and rib cages. Today, electric lights make the scenes less ominous, but no less surreal. This wasn't simply an ossuary. It was an engineered underworld, a blend of functionality, respect, and macabre display, a space designed to humble the living and give silent voice to the countless dead. Here, every wall is a reminder. Architecture can be beautiful and terrifying. Walk a few steps deeper into the catacombs of Paris, and the faces blur, because there are none. 6 million bodies reduced to identical bones, no names, no epitaphs, just rows upon rows of anonymous skulls, silently watching. But behind this eerie uniformity lies a haunting question. Who are they? The answer is everyone. The catacombs hold the remains of ordinary Parisians who lived and died over centuries. Bakers, servants, priests, midwives, soldiers, children. People who once crowded the city's cramped neighborhoods, who walked its muddy streets and worshipped in its cathedrals. When their graves overflowed and cemeteries began to rot, they were moved here, becoming part of this great subterranean ossuary. Some of the bones belong to victims of plagues, especially the Black Death and later cholera outbreaks. Disease killed in such numbers that cemeteries became mass graves. Others died in famines, fires, or childbirth. Some had been buried for centuries and were mostly skeletal when exhumed. Others had barely decomposed. The process of relocating them was unpleasant, grim, and unsentimental. A solution, not a ceremony. But not all the dead were commoners. The bones of French nobles, clergy, and revolutionaries also found their way here, especially as political upheaval swept the city. During the French Revolution, when guillotines turned public squares into rivers of blood, victims were often dumped in mass graves and later moved underground. Some claim the remains of key revolutionaries, like Danton, Robespierre, or Camille Desmoulins, were relocated to the catacombs, but no official records confirm their exact placement. Down here, titles and ranks disappear. There's also the curious case of the Val de Grace quarry section, believed to hold the bones of monks and nuns. These religious communities, once buried in convent gardens, were eventually displaced like everyone else when Paris needed more room for the dead. And then there are the children, smaller bones scattered among the stacks, no markers, no dates, just silent testimony to lives cut short. By design, the catacombs erase identity. In death, all are equal: peasant, poet, plague victim, or patriot. The anonymity is overwhelming. 6 million souls, reduced to geometry. And yet, in their silence, they speak of the sheer weight of history, of the cost of city life, and of a society that once stood shoulder to shoulder, and now lies skull to skull. While tourists shuffle through the official section of the catacombs, roughly a mile of sanitized, well-lit corridors, beneath their feet lies a forbidden world. A shadow network of uncharted tunnels, locked doors, and centuries-old pathways, crawling with graffiti, hidden chambers, and the occasional underground rave. Welcome to the domain of the cataphiles. Cataphiles are urban explorers who defy city law to access the forbidden zones of the Paris catacombs. They use hidden entrances, manholes in parks, storm drains, or basement trapdoors. Once inside, they navigate by memory, hand-drawn maps, or intuition. There are no signs, no safety rails, and no cell service, only the sound of your own footsteps echoing through the dark. This isn't just thrill-seeking. For many cataphiles, the catacombs are a second city, a sacred space of history, rebellion, and creativity. Over decades, they've carved out rooms in the tunnels, makeshift libraries, art galleries, and even cinemas. Some host clandestine parties deep underground, generators, speakers, and candlelight illuminating a dance floor built over stacked bones. The cataphile community is tight-knit and fiercely protective. Entry is often by invitation only. Newcomers, called tourists, are often tested for respect and survival skills. The golden rule? Never disturb the bones, never tag sacred sites, and never get caught, because this is all illegal. In 1955, French authorities declared all unofficial exploration of the catacombs prohibited. The risks were, and are, real. The tunnels are unstable in places, prone to collapse. Some are flooded. Others are filled with tight crawl spaces and dead ends that can disorient even seasoned explorers. Over the years, there have been injuries, arrests, and even deaths. In one notorious case, a man went missing for days and was found delirious in a remote section, guided out only by search dogs. Despite the dangers, the city's catacomb police, the cataflics, struggle to stop the trespassing. The system is simply too vast. Every time a known entrance is sealed, a new one is found. The cataphiles return. They always return. For them, the catacombs are more than bones. They are freedom, mystery, a place where Paris breathes differently, where time dissolves, and where the living walk alongside the dead, not in fear, but in reverence. Wander deep enough into the Paris catacombs, and the silence gives way. Not to voices, but to symbols. Messages scratched into limestone. Cryptic arrows, names, faces. Cryptic poetry in fading paint. This is the language of the tunnels. A tapestry of graffiti, signs, and secret codes left by generations of cataphiles, workers, soldiers, and the dead. Some of the oldest markings come from quarrymen, centuries before the catacombs became a burial site. These early miners carved dates, initials, and directional arrows into the walls to track where they'd been. Many engraved their names with pride, like time-stamped signatures in the earth. Others marked exits, stone quality, or left sketches, simple images of pickaxes, candles, even ships. These weren't just idle doodles, they were survival tools in a lightless maze. Once the catacombs became an ossuary, a new language emerged. Carved plaques from the 18th and 19th centuries that label which cemetery the bones came from. Some include haunting epigrams. Where is death? Always behind you. Others quote scripture or Latin maxims about the vanity of life and the certainty of death. But deeper in the forbidden zones, modern hands have added their own voice. Cataphile graffiti flourished in the 20th century. Some pieces are artistic masterpieces, elaborate murals painted by flashlight, entire walls transformed into glowing skeletons, mythical beasts, or surreal portraits. Other markings are practical. Arrows pointing toward known exits, nicknames etched into stone, or coded directions like GV Chalak 30 Mins to Montrouge. The tunnels have their own unofficial map, an oral cartography passed among cataphiles. Locations bear cryptic names. The beach, a sand-filled cavern. The cellar, the cathedral, the sandbox. Some walls are nicknamed for the images on them. The mushroom forest, the elephant room. Without this insider knowledge, getting lost isn't just possible, it's almost guaranteed. There are also marks of occupation. Candle holders carved into walls, benches made of scavenged stone, rusted hinges where makeshift doors once stood. Some explorers bring stencils or ink stamps, marking their visits like underground passports. Others leave behind poems, bottle caps, or small figurines, quiet offerings to a world of eternal night. In the catacombs, language becomes legacy. Every scrawl, every arrow, every whisper in paint is part of an evolving chronicle telling us someone was here, someone passed through, and someone wanted to be remembered. During times of war, the Paris catacombs were more than a macabre curiosity. They became a battlefield in the shadows. Beneath the streets, while bombs fell and regimes shifted above, the catacombs served as shelter, hideout, and strategic weapon. For centuries, they've been a part of Paris's wartime story, quiet, secretive, and essential. During the French Revolution, bones were still being transferred underground, but the tunnels were already becoming more than storage. As the guillotine claimed heads by day, the catacombs absorbed the mounting remains by night. Rumours swirled that revolutionaries used the tunnels to move undetected across the city, plotting in the dark. These passages weren't just for the dead, they were tactical. In World War II, the catacombs entered a new chapter of intrigue. When Nazi Germany occupied Paris in 1940, the Wehrmacht and the SS mapped sections of the catacombs for military use. In one infamous case, a bunker was constructed beneath the Lycée Montaigne, right within the tunnel system. Hidden from the Allies, it served as a command post, complete with reinforced walls, supply storage, and communication lines. But the resistance was watching. The French resistance, ever resourceful, also used the catacombs. Underneath enemy-controlled Paris, they navigated these tunnels with expert knowledge, staging ambushes, smuggling weapons, and conducting meetings in the echoing dark. It was a game of subterranean cat and mouse. One level below the Nazis, French fighters moved like ghosts. The cataphiles of the time, those already familiar with the unofficial sections, became invaluable. Their knowledge of hidden entrances and obscure routes turned the catacombs into a guerrilla labyrinth. Some sections still show evidence of their presence. Resistance graffiti, remains of ration cans, and even defensive structures built into the stone. Bomb shelters were carved during air raids. Ordinary citizens sometimes fled to the tunnels during Allied bombings or Nazi crackdowns. Down there, in the stillness, families waited. Bones on one side, war above, hope somewhere in between. After the war, many of these wartime sections were sealed off or forgotten, but traces remain. A rusted door, a pile of gas mask filters, a scorched wall. The catacombs held secrets long before the 20th century, but in wartime, they became something more. A crucible of survival, resistance, and the quiet defiance of a city that refused to die. Where there are bones and darkness, legends follow. The Paris catacombs are no exception. Over the centuries, these tunnels have become the breeding ground for myths, ghost stories, and urban legends that blur the line between reality and nightmare. Once a burial solution, the catacombs now host a folklore of their own, one that continues to grow with every new echo in the dark. One of the most famous tales is that of the Phantom of the Catacombs. Some say it's a long-dead quarryman who got lost and now wanders the tunnels, his footsteps heard but never seen. Others claim he's a plague victim, cursed to roam the ossuary forever, seeking his lost family among the 6 million skulls. Whether ghost or metaphor, visitors and explorers alike have reported disembodied whispers, cold gusts of air, and sudden nausea in certain sections of the tunnels, especially near older, untouched ossuaries. Then there's the legend of the camcorder tape. In the early 1990s, a group of cataphiles allegedly found a video camera deep in a restricted section. The footage, later broadcast on French television, showed a man wandering alone through the tunnels, increasingly panicked, running, spinning, lost. Eventually he drops the camera. No one knows who he was or what happened to him. The clip ends in silence, and he was never identified. The story became modern myth, the lost explorer who never found the surface again. Other stories are more surreal. There are whispered accounts of rooms filled with human bones arranged into chairs and thrones, or of underground cults using the catacombs for rituals. One sealed chamber, discovered in the early 2000s, had a working phone line, a fully stocked bar, and an underground cinema. On the wall, a chilling message: do not try to find us. Despite skepticism, the power of the catacombs mythos is undeniable. It feeds on the natural fear of the dark, the unknown, and the sheer weight of death. The space is real, but the stories, they live in the gaps, between candlelight and shadow, between echoes and silence. Whether you believe the tales or not, one thing is certain. Deep beneath Paris, fear breathes easily, and the catacombs never sleep. Today, the catacombs of Paris are one of the city's strangest and most visited attractions. Each year, hundreds of thousands descend into this empire of death, not for funerals or rituals, but for curiosity, for selfies with skulls, for the thrill of standing among 6 million of the once living. It's a place where mortality is laid bare, yet marketed with a ticket stub and a brochure. The official ossuary, opened to the public in 1809, was originally intended to be a place of reflection, a memento mori for a city too focused on the surface. Early visitors were guided through by lantern light, sometimes accompanied by priests or scholars. Today the lighting is brighter, the walls more secure, but the feeling remains. A quiet awe, a dread mixed with wonder. Tourism has only grown since the 19th century. Poets, philosophers, and artists have long been drawn to the catacombs. Victor Hugo wandered its depths for inspiration. Salvador Dalí called it beautiful. And for many, it's become a pilgrimage, not just to confront death, but to marvel at how meticulously death has been organized, stacked, and displayed. Yet the catacombs remain controversial. Critics argue that turning mass graves into tourist attractions is disrespectful, reducing human lives to decor. Others point out that few visitors realize what they're seeing. These aren't props. They're people. Real individuals, once with names, faces, families, now anonymous relics of a buried past. Still, the catacombs serve a powerful purpose. They remind us of scale, the sheer number of lives lived before us. They are, quite literally, the foundation of Paris, the dead supporting the living. Bones that once carried bread, books, or revolution now hold up the city's myths and sidewalks. But strangely, the moment you climb the staircase and return to the surface, Paris feels different. Louder, brighter, more alive. Because in the end, the catacombs don't glorify death. They sharpen our sense of life, its fragility, its brevity, and its beauty. Beneath Paris lies its deepest truth. Everything we build on bones. And someday, perhaps the city will add ours to the archive.